Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh of First Nations. Thanks very much for coming up this afternoon. My name is Laurie White. I'm Public Programs Coordinator here at Griffin for this exhibition, Zero Ground, which is curated by Lee Plested, and also Director of Griffin Art Projects. We have been working together to put on a series of programs over the course of the show that kind of intersect with and open up the exhibition for deeper dialogue and also approach it from a number of different perspectives. So that might be the artists that are in the exhibition, or a curator, or artists that we've invited to do responses to the exhibition. We have two different events today, back to back. The first is a talk with Lee Plested on Frank Stella's black paintings that are represented in the exhibition by a series of Gemini edition lithographs. And then following that at 2 o'clock, local artist Guadalupe Martinez is going to respond to the exhibition through a performance in action, which begins off-site and then comes back into the gallery and activates the pile of dirt that's in there. I just wanted to say a couple of words about the exhibition and the themes of the show to kind of set the scene. At its core, this exhibition investigates the operation of negation as a kind of technique in modern and contemporary art. Since Kazimir Malevich's 1915 work Black Square, which was a monochrome black monochrome. The title of the exhibition also responds to the last futurist exhibition of painting, 010, which occurred in 1950 in Petrograd, Russia. And from this operation of negation and blackness spring a range of questions about figure-ground relationships, strategic withdrawal or withholding of information, and productive destructions. So I also want to say that next Saturday is the final weekend of the exhibition. We'll be closing the show with two interrelated performative lectures by local artists, Randy Lee Cutler and Marina Roy. And they're going to do, their project is titled Dark Matters, and their sort of interrelated talks will address the cultural and political histories of coal and bitumen in relation to the exhibition. So without further preamble, I'd like to introduce Lee Plested. Plested is a Vancouver-based curator and writer who's organized numerous exhibitions for galleries across the US and Canada, including the Nelson Gallery, the Confederation Center at PEI, Illingworth Kerr Gallery in Calgary, and the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Gallery in Vancouver, as well as the Western Gallery in Bellingham. His writing has appeared in Canadian Art, Moments, Art 21, and Art Forum. He's director of Griffin Art Projects, where he recently curated Louis Balt's Civilization Inverted, an extensive exhibition of Canadian painter Paul P. in collaboration with Scrapmetal Gallery Toronto. The title of his talk today is Black Origins, Frank Stella's Black Paintings. Please join me in welcoming Lee Plested.
This exhibition is largely from our founders' collection, the Fridays. And then in addition to that, to sort of expand on the discourse within the exhibition, I invited 3 artists to contribute work as well. That's Denzel Hurley, who is here, Beata Terflo, who did the wall drawings around the corner, and Amber Jimenez, whose video is in the back. And as Laurie was saying, it's been great working with her to think of other ways to create discussions and platforms for integration with the exhibition. In general, this exhibition basically came from an idea that I had in conversation, that Henning Freiby had about the impact of the monochrome on contemporary art and how relevant it was to their collection specifically. And so I started working with that from there. He did a very good thing, which was at that point he had the opportunity to purchase the entire first set of black lithographs by Frank Stella. And I said, well, these are these incredibly important things. And this is sort of this pivot. If we think of Malevich's Black Square as a first moment of abstraction, or first sort of revolutionary act, Frank Stella's black paintings are often cited as that moment in American history that goes from abstract expressionism to minimalism. And so is another one of those incredible pivotal moments. In terms of further interest and discovery, I then started thinking about them in more depth, and that's what the work that I want to share with you guys today is my thinking about that. So amidst the expressive gestures made by painters in mid-century New York, there arrived an unwelcome interloper. This stormy turbulent was a little gritty, rough around the edges, and decidedly unsophisticated compared to the enlightened heights of the high abstraction of America at that time, which was really these people, right? So this new propensity jabbed at the austere accomplishments of that city's painters, the acknowledged titans that had with a new sense of social discontent. So here we see the irascibles, as they were known, which were basically the abstract expressionists, and their antics were brought to national attention through Life magazine, where they culminated as a group to protest against the jury of the Metropolitan Museum's exhibition American Painting Today 1950, because a lot of the painting that was being included still had that horrible thing called a figure, which they didn't want anymore. You know, they had a very specific purpose for modernistic painting, and they were against anything else. To the point that several of these painters left the lead gallery at that time. So Robert Motherwell, Rothko, Philip Guston, and Gottlieb left the Sydney Janus Gallery in 1962 to protest the exhibition of new realist works that the gallery held. So they were like, no figuration, no real world, we're out here, we're leaving now. This was the unthinkable, it was the return of the real. So for more than 2 decades through the 1940s and 50s in the US cultural discourse, art's apparent autonomy created a philosophical and rhetorical device which demanded an internalized artistic process, a program of formal articulations which defended and defined painting's purpose as established in its own internal logic, art defining its own system of value. So mostly done through pointing to Manet, who, as the predecessor that established this potential for art's sake, this Greenbergian and essentialist modernist program had brought image making past the point of responsibility to the real, to the picture, beyond the idea of the picture. Inherent in this new critical reading was the negation of bourgeois decadence represented in Déjeuner sur la Heure, the Manet painting that we're looking at, as educated viewers' attention was now being brought only to the flattest areas of suggestion, so really the green fields on the ground, ignoring the flirtatious figures on the lawn. Its radicalism was purported to be based in its materiality, even more than the painter's ironic reworking of social portraiture, his insistence on a critical class consciousness. Quote, "It is what we have as the present form of modernism, an art whose object is nothing but itself, which never tires of discovering that the self is pure as only pure negativity can be, and which offers its audience that nothing tirelessly, and I can see, adequately made over into form," T.J. Clark explained in an investigation of Greenberg's early writings. So T.J. Clark is a major art historian looking back at Greenberg's, the central articulator of American modernist perspective. What was articulated in Greenberg's programmatic texts attested to the fact that advanced art would only make headway if it was isolated from the grim circumstances of the real, free from its circumcising containments, its ideological programs. Put forward was the idea that the affluence of modern society provided the space for this new internal order. Art was therefore tied to bourgeois culture. So as autonomous as it was also tied to its own production. So Clark argues by an umbilical cord of gold, and is uncertain of Greenberg's mapping of this conflict, which he describes as pressure in which avant-garde is in direct relation, well oppositional to the bourgeois. The connoisseurs providing support for art to function freely from the ideological divisions, above the fray and a generally accepted rejection of the easy legibility of the pictorial as common, as kitsch, and as consumerism. So he's rejecting this dichotomy that's set up in Greenberg. In the words of Clark, and the avant-garde, I shall argue, has regularly and rightly seen an advantage for art in the particular conditions of ideological confusion and violence under capitalism. It has wished to take part in the general and tidy work of negation and has seen no necessary contradiction, rather the contrary, between doing so and coming to terms once again with its medium. This critical analysis feels as relevant to the abstract expressionists, so his analysis of what the possibilities of this critical potential is, affecting a new avant-garde within the production line of mid-century America, as to the constructivist manifestos which this current exhibition proposes underlies the negating formal potential pursued in 20th and 21st century art. To bring a sort of forming perspective on this, I turned to McLuhan in terms of media studies, and he said, the theater of the absurd dramatizes this recent dilemma of Western man, the man of action who appears not to be involved in the action. Such is the origin and appeal of Samuel Beckett's clowns. After 3,000 years of specialist explosion and of increasing specialism and alienation in the technological bodies, our world has become compressed by dramatic reversal. And that examination of the origin and development of the individual extensions of man should be preceded by a look at some general aspects of the media or extensions of man, beginning with the never explained numbness that each extension brings about in the individual and society. I propose this as a type of methodology to think about Frank Stella's paintings and this situation within this modernist discourse. So this purification through negation of content would reach a pressure point in the work by Frank Stella referred to as the black paintings, often cited as the gesture in American art which quenched the expressive thirst of American abstraction and launched the cool and industrialized methods known as minimalism. I'm particularly interested in his incorporation of real-world titles to these otherwise deeply negative paintings. In examining this combination of the identifiable and unrepresentational, or unrelational, as Stella would describe them, it is important to understand the support system which created an atmosphere for Stella to realize both himself and his artistic extension in various media, including the work itself, to compile a deeper understanding of the construction of his initial critical potential. In doing so, it may be possible to glimpse that shimmering umbilical cord which may be laid apparent if unspoken, not just as the unsaid dimension of a highly articulate artist's project, but as a goal which is equal to his radicalism and formed through an extension of his media-constructed personality. By looking a bit behind these nearly blank images, past their dissolved horizon line to the various material aspects that oscillated around their production, I will argue that in the end, formalist production, with its more neutralizing than negating tendencies, won over the proposed early interest in having critical social content, a naming of his alienated and systemized manufacture. Avoiding an actual formalist readings of the works, I am drawn to the construction of Stella, the artist, as a means to dissect what systems of value involve this early moment of critical recognition and where it would play out in the future. Here we have Stella in front of the famous Cedar Tavern, the claimed home of the abstract expressionists, and boxing ground for the artist to defend their new aesthetic activities in painting. Here he is wearing the required uniform of the abstract expressionists, the weathered jumper, and soiled dungarees. The photo, of course, is by Hollis Frampton from The Secret World of Frank Stella, 1958 to 1962. So, in the words of Michael Fried, it is ironic that modernist painting is often described as nihilistic and its practitioners characterized as irresponsible charlatans. This tendency towards breakdown has been intensified in the past 20 years by the quickening that has taken place in the rate of self-transformation within modernism itself, a quickening that, in turn, has been the result of an increase in formal and historical self-awareness on the part of the modernist painters. The work of such painters as Nolan, Olitsky, and Stella not only arises largely out of their personal interpretations of the particular situations in which advanced painting found itself at crucial moments in their respective developments, their work also aspires to be adjudged in retrospect to have been necessary in the finest modernist painting of the future. And I bring this articulation of its historical dialectic, because I want this to be foregrounded as one of the main apparatuses which Stella saw his works being received in. First shown at the Allen Memorial Gallery in Oberlin College in 1958 as a part of the three young Americans, while Stella was still a sophomore at Princeton, and quickly followed up by their inclusion in 16 Americans in 1959 at MoMA. These nihilistic sepulchres of modernist progress were deeply self-aware of the apparatuses of high culture in New York at that moment, and the necessity to extend oneself within this system of progress. Effectively, both Stella and his austere stripe paintings were catapulted to recognition. It is interesting to consider how Stella's paintings themselves were the message, his ambition shaped by the form which painting had become, and how its subsequent mediation happened through established channels which were contemporaneous to their epoch and embedded within this thrust of modernist intentionality. In looking at the material evidence, it is my position that Stella didn't arrive at this method of cultural extension on his own. I mean, who could, but for him it was particular. In fact, he was trained into it, graduating high school from the prestigious Phillips Academy in Andover, where he first met many famous artists, along with his fellow classmate Carl Andre, and continuing to Princeton, where he would study with the great articulators of American abstraction, Joseph Albers and Hans Hofmann. Stella was nurtured in the academic discipline of art. The New York landscape was so familiar from his frequent visits to study through copying modern art, so once again dialectical to the history of painting, right? But completely embedded in a modernist tradition, going and copying one of those. But that by the time that Frank arrived at number 5 Aldridge Street in 1958, in the words of critic Peter Stedall, Stella's swagger made him a god. This mythical imaging of the artist's genius is witnessed in a series of photos taken of him by Hollis Frampton, another chum from Phillips. While living with Stella and Andre, Frampton started a series which he titled The Secret World of Frank Stella. Capturing the artist in posed portraits and engaged in this unexpressive method of paint handling, these images can hardly be conceived outside the influence of Hans Nauma's film and photos of Pollock, or as a possible parody of Picasso's close-ups. I mean, he was by then the most famous artist in the world and highly photographed and mediated. Michael Aupen, curator of the 2016 Stella retrospective, describes them well. Stella is photographed as representing a myriad of identities, laboriously finishing one of his black paintings, mischievously standing by a barber's pole that mimics the lines in his concentric paintings, or seated in a bulldozer at a construction site. To my mind, it is not only a reflection of Stella's changing artistic personality, but a photographic analogy to his point-counterpoint approach to art making. This drive for documenting his production, for mediating and mythologizing recognition, is a key to the careerism I argue would soon redirect the initial social political potential in Stella's work in the direction of a more easily digested product. In an interview in 2012, Stella recalls the day when Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher came into the Cedar Tavern. First struck by their celebrity, he then realized that he was taller than Fisher, and in his words, Frank Stella's quite short, he's quite short, and in his words, felt like there was hope for a schmuck like him. So already modeling himself off the bar's residence, the abstract expressionist, he continued to nurture a public image that would manifest in a series of interviews, his eye firmly set on the American dream of becoming bigger than he was. It is this desire for structuring a personality for popular approval that informed the Frampton image, accompanied by a text from Andre, which represented Stella in the catalog for 16 Americans, as we see here. Here, compared to the studio and field shots, Stella is all grown up, a regular city slicker. He's the only artist whose ideas are represented by an authored text and whose photo feels professional rather than bohemian. Curator Dorothy Miller had asked Stella for a more informal portrait, not realizing that the styling had been calculated. Part dry wit, playing uptown while he lived down, but still resonating with his prep school origins. The suited artist was imaged as a modern executive, contrapposto. By wearing that glamorous suit, Stella was dressed up, conveying some aspiration other than the marginal, tolerated bohemian role. In theory, the paintings that resulted from such a position might continue to be expressions, but they could be expressions of a different and hence dangerous artistic persona. Stella's provocations clearly understood what was at stake, not artistic style, not even the choice of artistic subject, but the very nature of being an artist in post-war America. The construction of the artist through a myriad of identities as an effective way of distinguishing himself in the marketplace. Placing himself within the stream, he set to make the paintings of the future. So this says, insofar as his accompanying sketches, and this is, accompanying sketches define the early body of work as a crucible for the eventual development of a modular economy. It is important to note that the retrospective and partial nature of his analysis of his own practice, which tends to close down other concerns or directions that were latent or even salient in the 1958 corpus. Most especially, the one contemporary artist whose work is everywhere present in the Pratt sheet. So the Pratt sheet is this sketch of the black paintings, and that he systemizes the way that he's going to develop this internal, and I'm trying to avoid formal descriptions of it, but this internal logic that covers the entire field while has an activity that is constantly moving in every direction. So it's where he starts to articulate his formal practice. But whose name is consciously absent is Jasper Johns. It is perhaps Johns alone, at least in retrospect, who can recount the two sides of the sheet, its wanderings and its proto-non-relational painting. This is from Maria Goff when she's talking about Frank Stella as a constructionist. So this is Jasper Johns' Green Target painting from 1955. When Stella saw Jasper Johns' Green Target in an exhibition at the Jewish Museum, New York in 1956, he had identified a model of future potential. In the interview with Michael Oppen, Stella talks about how Johns' influence was not specifically a model for non-relational symmetrical paintings, but that the influence of Jasper was as a force and as a new idea of something happening at the time, that even more so than even the formal aspects of the paintings themselves. He articulated this in a more exposed way during an interview for USA Artist 1962, that there was a lot of talk about Johns' work and whose legitimation he encountered before he even saw it, and this showed him the new direction to follow. So just as much as an interest in the symmetrical, concentric form that was Johns' painting, he was also interested in the persona that was Johns and trying to step into that role as an American artist. Its repetitive organization and reductive visual field, which proclaimed its process, resonates in Stella's career making black works. He also knew about, at that time, through reputation and reproduction, the black painting of Robert Rauschenberg. Both works felt responsive to a painter Stella identified as an early influence, Franz Klein, whose powerful black marks gave an important negative precedent to their monochromes. So Klein, then Johns, Rauschenberg. So Stella's paintings themselves were conceived as a process that removed expression, a negation of any spiritual social dimension in exchange for a rational, repetitive purity. In the same interview from 1972, he gestures to Beckett as a literary reference, where lean situations where not much happens is a lot like repetition. Through the use of a flat, regulated pattern, I could make a painting situation which read or seemed flatter, and I felt that flatness was a kind of absolute necessity at that time. So again, he's really talking about what the conditions in New York are and how he's seen his own work within that situation. Conforming to the parameters of the canvas, articulating its space to create an image that filled the entire space with activity, they were made by applying parallel lines of black enamel paint to a canvas in a predetermined pattern. leaving a quarter-inch gap between the flatly applied bands, the stripes themselves, the width of a house painter's brush. The bare canvas below was read at that time as a figurative element, the negative as the positive, leading critics to describe them as pinstripe paintings. This perspective was strongly rejected by Stella, who wanted to dissolve notions of figure and ground in an ultimate realization of Manet's journey into flatness. As this original painter of modern life, Manet, once said, "No one can be a painter unless they care for painting above all else." And Stella seemed to take up this proclamation as an end game of sorts. Again, Beckett's influence resonates. Dedicating himself to painting as a machine. This realization of a bleak and emotionless reflection of an industrialized America, anticipated by Warhol here, which was embedded in his work at this time. This was also a part of the influence of Johns and Rauschenberg, working artists with reputations whose paintings he had seen at Castelli and in various group exhibitions which he aspired to. Although he is the clear inheritor of Naumann's stripes and Rothko's autonomous rectangular achievements, for me it is still the green target of Jasper Johns, which he gestured to then and now as a source of inspiration. The repetitive patterning as a visual element that could hold the picture is what we take from this. Yet it seems to me that the inclusion in Johns' work of mimicking objects from the world as subject, even if embedded in stark formalism, was in the air in New York, and that this was integrated as another element in Stella's project through his titles. Johns as a model for Stella from his days in Princeton, and it seems that the pop content of this project would not be lost on a young Ivy League student. This social dimension or inclusion of the real in Stella's titles is argued against by Robert Hobbs in his essay for the exhibition Frank Stella Connections, where he rejects the text of MoMA curator William S. Rubens as conservative, which means for him formalist. Quote, as in Stella's other subsequent series, there is an underlying unity among the titles of the black paintings, though these titles are arrived at less systematically than later ones were. The earlier rectilinear black paintings bear titles reflecting what Stella calls downbeat or depressed civic political situations. Stella's titles constitute personal associations with the pictures, and he would be horrified at the idea that a viewer might use them as a springboard to content. But the very fact that their existence, quite apart from the particular nature of the metaphors involved, suggests the way in which Stella is drawn to associations whose ambiguities potentially subvert the formal and intellectual rigor of his art. This subversion, in fact, seems to amplify the potential of these titles, aligning his populist labeling with the negativity of the monochrome itself, that a negative dimension is embedded in these paintings and reflect social conditions. Hobbs is likewise critical of Baltimore Museum curators Brenda Richardson, who he identifies as picking up Rubens' position and takes her to task for not presenting Stella's perspective on titles as inconsistent yet necessary identifying labels. This inconsistency provided Richardson the occasion to associate his titles with melancholy, empathy, blacks, and jazz, and most controversially, an uneasy encounter with fascism, she had said. With the list of Stella's selected identifiers coming from Nazi propaganda, tenements, depressing song titles, black and deviant nightclubs, in Richardson's mind, for Stella to call the titles downbeat is clearly an understatement. She goes on to describe that while Stella may not necessarily link the identifier to the form's content, that it would be difficult to ignore the relationship between the black of the painting and the Italian black shirts. There seems to be convincing evidence that Stella assigned titles to the black paintings based on his association of content as well as form. This is actually echoed much later by Stella when he explained to Oppen that there is essentially a problem with being young and having an idea of what you want to do and sort of following it through. So you follow the idea through with the black paintings. They are basically dark, industrial, prone to disaster or destruction, or whatever you'd like to call it, a burnt out quality. One was called the Reichstag. So things are there, and it's hard not to pick up on something like Arbeit macht frei, or work makes you free, which also came from a Nazi slogan. At that time, asked by Oppen about the enamel paint he utilized in these burnt-out pictures, he said that he was inspired by Mr. Clean, that it was industrial-state painting to use conventional commercial paints, but there was a precedence for that in Pollock, and that this related to responding to the ideas of his time. With the acknowledgement of the critical community focused on the discussion that spurred formal convention and his personal success essentially in hand, he saw no need to further any political dimension in his work after the black paintings. The black paintings mark the end of his transitional period. The metallic works mark a point where his art becomes purely retinal. This is Avacena from 1960, which immediately followed the black paintings, and instead of being named after a social situation or something from an object from a dissonant social situation, it's now named for a Persian polymath, maybe more homage than a type of active subversion. Well, the pleasing aspect of these works continue to be their negation of imagistic illusion. They turn away from the mention of parallel social negativities and foreground their erudite, educated, and worldly presence. Developed in series, these works were focused on market success. Following the metal paintings was the Benjamin Moore series, titled after the name of each store-bought color. This is the moment where Stella, for me, moves into purely decorative gestures, in dazzling virtuosic formal variations that answer the need for pure aesthetic production. The potential of social commentary would be picked up by the pop artist and eventually have an equal impact on the theorizing of value in the future of in the future, as had the negation of the black paintings. However, for Stella, it would be an ongoing search into the increasing Baroque elements of form which would define his oeuvre. At this moment, I'd like to go and look at some of these lithographs themselves, and maybe as a group talk about this idea of the potential of this work having a type of social content at that time, how that ends up realizing itself in the lithographs in, for me, a muted and commodified way, and how this whole sort of sensibility underlies this exhibition in a certain way. So let's go around and look at the lithographs. So Stella was convinced that he would never make lithographs. It felt like it was too close to drawings and therefore studies, like what he did for his works otherwise. And he was really committed to the idea of this non-expressive, non-gestural painting technique that even though in the original black paintings there was a little waviness or physicality to them, that they were essentially a sort of alienated or modernist form of application. But in 1967, Kenneth Tyler from Gemini invited Frank Stella to make these, and he said, if I was ever to make a drawing, I just do it with a magic marker. And so he invented this weird thing that was kind of like a magic marker, but was actually a lithographic pen. And so at that point, and also convinced Stella that they had a pigment that was close enough to the materiality of the original black paintings that he thought that it was transferable. So Stella does a few things to take, these things that operated in a very physical and disarming way, not only because of their 3-inch stretcher bar, but also because of the play of figure ground, or the white negative space behind the positive space of the black, when really you see it as this negative thing with maybe white potential. So that kind of confusing figure ground relationship. The first thing that he does is he just aligns them all to the lower left-hand corner, which he felt made them less imagistic and more in idea that it would be more mechanical and controlled by a sort of modernist sense in that way. He then also, in kind of, in that ongoing dialectic with modernist ideas of art making, sat there and drew all of these things. He could have, at this point, probably as he did in his future paintings, just sort of got rid of the hand, but there was a certain part of him that wanted that still there. When we look at Getty's tomb here, as opposed to encountering it as a single form that really looks like a tomb, we, for me, lose some of that relationship to that painting, to the idea of this tomb. It becomes much more of a constrained and sort of representative, almost iconographic relationship to the black paintings. In that way, for me, as compelling and beautiful and interesting as they are formally, they fail to continue to pick up that social potential in the way that, obviously it goes to an extreme with the Warhol, where it's all social, again, directly out of the newsreel, but all pictorial representation and this kind of formalist implication. By this time, Frank was making real money. He's working through the Stella Gallery. He's like producing body after body of work that's getting placed with major museums. And he's having an increasingly bourgeois lifestyle. He's traveling to these other cities that he's making these paintings after. It's no longer just living in the Lower East Side and reading the newsreel and hanging out at clubs. He's growing up and becoming a different type of person. And so that's where, for me, they start to move into something that's purely formal. And even though he still associates them with the original titles and their fame, they become something that's much more about just pictorial form, not potential for art to talk about social critical landscape. And that was really my decision in this exhibition, thinking about there's a lot of ways that the monochrome has impacted the history of art, and how can we narrow down what our perspective was. And so with this exhibition, this was an excellent starting point, because I thought what I was interested in, and that I hope that the exhibition expresses, is that this type of formalism as a tool in art, for me, is a strong method of creating a space where you see an issue, an image, an idea in a new and evocative way. That knowing that this is Getty's tomb and feeling it, feeling that type of constrictive social conflict, knowing that it's Getty's tomb and having that other types of pathos with it brings us back into the real, brings us back into the issues of our day. And that in fact is what I think a lot of people are doing with their work. For example, in Stand-Up with Hogan's Alley, he's referencing this negating potential that is the monochrome as a type of erasure that's literal to the content of the image, where it's an image, reconstructed image of a neighborhood that's been destroyed. And that, like the Warhol as well, the absolute negation of the black on black monochrome really opens up this other sort of social dimension and understanding of what that image is, what the potential of making images like that is for a critical relationship to our arts. Any comments? Yes?
I think you mentioned this already, but with the lithographs, you mentioned earlier the things that Frank Stella really rejected the idea that empty space, positive space for attention. It's like, no, there's no relationship between foreground and background. It's completely like issues with dissolve.
that it's easier to read them as like a representation of the black paintings and the history of the black paintings and the idea of the black paintings than having the formal potential of the black paintings themselves. And for me, I think that that is no longer his interest. In fact, all of that radicality that's in the early black paintings gets, for me, very quickly dissolved. I mean, there's no doubt that Stella is an astonishing formalist and he accomplishes many other things. But I'm the most interested in the art that has a relationship to the real. And he loses that interest. No. Yeah, I hope that discourse isn't that absolute. I think Frank Stella's black paintings are some of the most amazing things ever made, and definitely some of the most influential. However, we do have to have a critical understanding of what their role in the history of art is and what their contribution to the overall conversation of ideas that have come after them. For me, I'm making an argument that he lost his potential after he lost his cool titles. You know, that from there it just gets increasingly devoid of any critical or social content very quickly. But that was inherent in the early works. And it's because he was looking at pop art. But he gets rid of, you know, super trained. Is careerism a problem in art? I think a lot of